Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sandeen Lecture in the Humanities. I'm so glad to see you all. What a great room of people. I am Scott Hinkle. I'm the director of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, and it is my great joy to welcome you to hear Dr. Kayla Burd give this year's Sandeen Lecture, the title of which is The Plight and Peril of Children in Wyoming's Juvenile System, a Legal, Historical, and Psychological Analysis. Welcome to those of you here in the room. Welcome to friends joining us via Wyocast. I want to give a special welcome to our friends at the Wyoming Children's Law Center for helping to promote the lecture, and also to our friends at the Wyoming Bar Association who have made this evening's lecture part of their continuing education program. Thank you. Thanks also to our friends at the Wyoming Humanities Council, who are our co-sponsors every year for the Sandeen Lecture. The Sandeen Lecture is named for Dr. Eric Sandeen, sitting right there. Who is the founding director of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. Thank you, Eric, for so much work over so much time to help us do things like tonight. We appreciate it. The Sandeen Lecture takes place annually on the Monday of finals week during the fall semester. Each year, the Humanities Research Institute invites a group of faculty to participate in the Humanities Research Group program. And that group of faculty, 7 this year, spend the entire year working on their projects in progress, which lead to books and grant applications and essays and public performances and exhibitions. At the end of that experience, the fellows in the research group program vote to decide who among them will deliver the next year's lecture. So the Sandeen Lecture is a special honor. It shows the respect that the lecturer has given to them by their peers. A couple of quick notes. Dr. Burd will deliver her lecture, and then directly after the lecture, there'll be ample and generous time for questions and comments. Friends joining us on Wyocast, you can just type your questions into the box, and they will arrive via email, and we'll read them right along with folks in the room, too. Please also join us at the conclusion of today's lecture. We'll have a reception in the Cooper House. The Cooper House is right over there on the corner of Grand and 15th. Please join us. There'll be food, there'll be wine, and there'll be more conversation, I'm sure. If you want to keep in touch with the Humanities Research Institute, just please send an email to humanities@uwyo.edu, and we will add you to our mailing list so you hear about events like this one. Please also follow us on all of the things, on the YouTubes and the Facebooks and all that sort of stuff. Please do. On our YouTube channel, you can see recordings of all of our past events, and with some luck, Dr. Bird's lecture will be up for other people to view within the next couple of days. So please help me welcome Dr. Marina Yunez, who will introduce Dr. Burd.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for being here. Scott just told us a little bit about the origins and the importance of the Sandeen Lecture Series in Humanities, but now it's my honor to introduce you to the Sandeen Lecturer today, Dr. Kayla Burd. So, a little bit of biography here. Kayla received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Hofstra University in Long Island, or Long Island, depending on where you're from. She got her master's and her PhD from Cornell University, from the very same program that I came from. So there's a camaraderie there. Now, what you need to know about the program, about Cornell's graduate program, is that it's a very well-known program for the study of psychology and law. But what's unique about Cornell is also a very significant program that focuses on human development. So if you go to Cornell, faculty and students in that program are likely to be studying how to best serve children and youth who bump into the legal system, whether as eyewitnesses, as victims, and even as perpetrators. Okay? After graduating from Cornell, Dr. Burd did 2-year postdoc at Iowa State University, which is also a very well-known psych and law program. in the country. Given her background, we in the psychology department were thrilled when we ran a search for a new psychology and law faculty member, and Kayla applied, was offered the position, and accepted the position. So we were so excited. The psychology department has a very successful but small PhD program in psychology and law. And we were so excited that Kayla, her husband Larry, and her daughter Juniper came to Laramie in 2020. So it was wonderful. And in every way, Dr. Burd has been an asset to the psych and law program. She's a gifted teacher, a prolific researcher, and an excellent mentor to our psych and law graduate students in our program. So she has been wonderful in that role. What I didn't realize, though, when we interviewed her, because we didn't talk about this, is that she also shared one of my passions, and that's juvenile justice. And she did not know this, but there have been a couple of us at UW who had spent more than 20 years, the past 20 years, working with communities and with the state on trying to improve our juvenile justice system. And when she came here and I realized that she loved this area as much as I was hoping she'd join us, and she absolutely did. She volunteered her time and her energy to help communities take their data, analyze it, interpret it, tell them what they, for free. She joined community committees on juvenile justice, and she even testified at a joint judiciary committee when our legislators were considering juvenile justice reform. She's given it her all in this area as well. In 2022, she received the Humanities Research Fellowship to take an in-depth look at Wyoming's juvenile justice system, a task that I think you'll understand after you hear her talk, that getting a handle on what happens to juveniles in this state when they touch the legal system is much harder than it seems. In any event, the fellowship has allowed Kayla the time to do an in-depth analysis of the juvenile justice system, which is the topic of her talk today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kayla Burd.
Oh my goodness. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. Before I begin, I want to extend some really warm thank yous to Dr. Scott Henkel. His leadership in WIRE has been stellar. He's the reason that so many of us get together in these exciting spaces. I'm just really grateful for his continued support. And I really want to thank one of my mentors, Dr. Norina Nunez, for her kind words and for being here today. And thank you for the generous support of Dr. Eric Sandeen for your generous support of this lecture, and thank you all for joining today. And it's an immense honor to be here to talk with you all about the juvenile system in Wyoming. So what we'll be talking about with our time together is that Wyoming's juvenile system is under great scrutiny. But this is not just a timely issue. It's been under great scrutiny for decades. The Wyoming juvenile system is failing our youth. Our youth don't have the outcomes that they could have were they treated differently under this system. And these massive failures lead to negative consequences for our youth, but also for future generations. Because when kids make contact with the legal system, we essentially assure them that we're going to see them time and time again, and we increase the likelihood that we're going to see their children too. So today, what I will argue is that there are several evidence-based changes that we could make that would greatly improve the outcomes of our kids. I want to begin with a little bit of data. It's been a while, so this data is from 2011. But I want to note that the extent to which our youth make contact in Wyoming with the justice system is at a much higher rate than some other countries. Now, certainly across the country, youth are over-detained. There's contact with the legal system for normative developmental behaviors. Being an adolescent is not a good time, or at least it wasn't when I was a teenager. So you can imagine that any sort of behavior that you might have engaged in when you were a youth, that could put you in contact with the legal system. Today I'm going to be talking a lot about confinement, and I want to start by operationalizing what I mean when I say confinement. So confinement for our purposes today is any out-of-home placement where kids are sent where they cannot leave on their own free will. So this does include detention, but it also might include other sorts of facilities, like group homes. So when I say confinement, it's any time we're taking kids out of their home, out of their community, and putting them somewhere where they are not free to leave. Now here's some data from 2011. This is comparing national and Wyoming percentages of why kids are incarcerated. So you might see this box right here, technical violations and status offenses. Technical violations might be things like violating parole or probation. Status offenses are the sorts of behaviors that if we engaged in as adults, we wouldn't make contact with the legal system. This might be things like vaping or underage drinking or truancy. But in this box, you see the blue averages are the national percentages for how often kids are confined for this reason, and these green bars are us. So things like, again, vaping at school, our children are at high risk of being confined. I want to say that everyone in my entire family would be confined if they lived in Wyoming. Everybody. But when you think about confinement, you might assume that that's a place where only the most violent offenders are. But that's not what's happening here. This is the index violent crimes here. Only 5% of our youth that were in confinement were there for violent crimes. So instead, they're there for things that are completely normative developmental time frames where you might engage in risky behavior. And probably all of us have done some of that. Today I'm going to be talking about preliminary evidence. So we were fortunate to get some data from the Department of Family Services that we could analyze to begin to get a sense of what's going on with youth in our state. And today we'll spend a lot of time talking about the racial and also geographic disparities that are happening. Now in Wyoming and other states, children can be separated from their families. They can be through court orders, and they might be confined to group homes or detention centers. In Wyoming, a lot of parents actually have to pay for these out-of-home placements. So children can be removed from families, and the financial burden of that placement can be put back onto families. Here's one such detention facility here. So this is the Natrona County Regional Juvenile Detention Center. These are sleeping quarters for kids. This is a day room. And I hope when you look at this, you think that that's not a place where I would want my kids, and that's not a place where kids thrive. Now, certainly as we'll talk about later, current procedures and processes in Wyoming have evolved over time. There are more developmentally sensitive techniques used at times, but today I'll be arguing that there's still a huge gap between our current procedures and processes and what would be evidence-based best practices for kids. How can we keep kids in the community? How can we keep them with their parents, their families? And how can we engage in evidence-based procedures so they have the best possible outcomes? Now, across the US, over 60,000 youth are detained at any time. Unfortunately, the data shows time and time again that our minority youth and children that have experienced adverse childhood experiences, those are the kids most likely to end up in the system. When I talk about adverse childhood experiences, I mean a myriad of terrible things that might happen with kids. This could include experiences with physical, emotional, sexual abuse. It includes physical and emotional neglect. And it also contains family systems. So children living in homes where they might have seen intimate partner violence, where they might have had family members that have substance abuse. Now, lots of recent data suggests that over 90% of children that become system involved, they've experienced one of these. In fact, some data suggests that only 3% of kids that are in the system haven't experienced one of these. 3%. And in fact, most data suggests that for children that are system involved, over half of them have 4 or more of these experiences. And in addition, over 85% of children that become system involved have other educational needs, high support needs, for things like reduced literacy. So when you think about the kids that are in the system, think about everything they went through before they ever became system involved. So today I'm going to argue that although youth involvement in criminal activity, whether higher level offenses or lower level offenses, that's been dramatically declining across time. And yet collectively and in Wyoming, we continue to use punitive rather than rehabilitative practices with them. And this is a bit surprising considering nationally the average shows that folks are more likely to endorse more rehabilitative practices for youth. But despite this changing sentiment, we continue to use these punitive approaches. So today I'm going to begin with a brief historical overview of Wyoming's juvenile system. Next, I'm going to present some preliminary evidence of inequality in the equality state. Then we're going to talk about the risks of youth confinement and system involvement more broadly, and why it's so imperative that we keep as many kids out as possible. And then we're going to talk about a few suggestions that are evidence-based and many scholars and advocates have proponents of, ways that we can work towards a just juvenile system. And then finally, I'll end with some concluding remarks. So we're going to begin, again, with a brief historical overview. Many people in this audience have worked tirelessly to improve the system over time, and so I'm only going to give you a brief glimpse today. So Wyoming's first legislative act actually took place in 1890, and its primary focus was actually protection-based. So this act was looking to protect children from abuses and neglect, and this act also established punishment for the adult perpetrators of these abuses. 9 short years later, though, there became a very high bar for intervening with kids. So 9 years later, this act passed, and it required 10 heads of households to verify or substantiate abuse. So this means 10 head of families, so probably 10 men in the community. But it's a pretty high bar to set in motion protections for kids. Now, in that same year, the first juvenile court came to Illinois. Now, this was focused on civil rather than criminal matters. And on the surface, people that were creating this court said it was for protective reasons, to try to help rehabilitate kids rather than punish them. But most of the literature around this time investigating what was going on politically really suggests that this juvenile court was actually there to help try to control impoverished children or immigrant children. But ever since then, across the country, many states and our state have increasingly used these punitive rather than rehabilitative approaches. In 1907, this bill passed for the training of delinquent children. So this established criteria whereby kids could be remanded to reform school for training. And frankly, a lot of the approaches we have today are quite similar. By 1910, 32 states across the US had established juvenile courts. By 1925, every state in the US, except for Maine and Wyoming, had established such courts. Well, we didn't have a juvenile court until 1948. And what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that even though we do have juvenile courts, the juvenile courts in our state are not the ones that are getting the majority of our kids. The majority of our kids are being seen elsewhere, in adult courts. And one of those reasons is because of concurrent jurisdiction, which was established in 1971. Pictured here is Professor John Berman. He was a UW faculty member. And he claimed that concurrent jurisdiction was one of the primary reasons that we were failing our kids. So with concurrent jurisdiction, juvenile courts, they don't have original jurisdiction over kids. When kids commit offenses, instead, prosecutors are the ones that determine which courts the kids are seen in. So our kids might be seen in municipal courts, or circuit courts, or district courts. And none of those courts, because they're meant for adults, can do any of the developmentally appropriate things that might be options were they seen in juvenile courts. And again, because prosecutors are deciding where kids should be seen, there's broad discretion and a ton of variability in what happens to kids once they're seen in these adult courts. Now, in 1981, there was the first major critical review of Wyoming's juvenile system, and they found some startling things that at the time were probably a little bit shocking to most people, except for the folks in this room that have been devoting their entire lives to these issues. But that report found extremely high rates of juvenile contact with law enforcement, well above the national average. That report found juvenile imprisonment of juveniles in adult jails among adults. And so the report pointed to a lack of system uniformity as one of the reasons why kids receive such disparate treatment. So that report called for a more unified system. Then in 1997, the Wyoming State Advisory Council on Juvenile Justice was established. As you can read here, the main goals were to improve the coordination and effectiveness of statewide and local delinquency prevention. I want you to really think about that prevention. Juvenile justice and youth services. And many of our own fantastic colleagues and some of my own mentors have devoted decades to this work. And in that same year, community juvenile service boards were established. And the goal of those boards was to do similar things, to try to identify kids early that were at risk of system involvement, and to try to connect them to some resources that might help keep them out of the system. Alas, in 2004, Professor Berman and our own Dr. Adrienne Frank conducted some intensive research on Wyoming's juvenile system. Professor Berman argued, Wyoming's juvenile justice system continues to suffer from the same deficiencies identified in 1981. With very similar findings, Dr. Adrienne Frank and her colleagues argued that the majority of juveniles still were being tried in municipal and circuit courts. The majority of juveniles were not being seen in juvenile courts. They found that youth were being subjected very frequently to the same sentencing as adults, and yet there was wide variability that didn't make sense. Dr. Adrienne Frank and colleagues argued what we've been talking about today. Normal adolescent behaviors with risky, impulsive youths, those behaviors are being criminalized. And they're being criminalized, and they're not having access to juvenile courts who could provide more developmentally appropriate treatment. Later in 2008, single point of entry was established. This is the reason that prosecutors have the discretion to determine where kids should be seen. And again, because of this broad discretion, because of our lack of standard ways of treating kids, this leads to really variable decision-making, with some kids making out okay, and some kids really getting the worst of it. And these decisions don't rely on any sort of standardized decision-making tools or processes. The last budget cuts then threatened the community juvenile service boards. Funding was recently reallocated, but I would argue that this instability in funding puts pressure on the communities. We don't know when there might be funds available for services that can help divert youth. And even now, primarily the money is being spent on diversion out of this system. So it's not really the same as being put towards preventative services before kids are making contact with the system. In 2008, there was another critical review of Wyoming's juvenile system. And I want to talk about this article by Jeremy Kissling because of an illustrative example that was included in this piece. So Kissling goes on to describe an adolescent in Wyoming, so a youth, right? He stole a key from school, the value of which was roughly $20. He was supposed to appear in court, but his family didn't know And he's a teenager. I don't know if you've ever met a teenager that remembered all of their things. He didn't appear in court. And because he failed to appear in court, he was actually arrested at school, taken out of school, taken to jail, and then tried as an adult. So in this piece, Kissling argues for juveniles to be adjudicated in juvenile courts, where the focus would be more on the cause of a behavior and the prevention of future behaviors, rather than punishing these normative youth behaviors. So since 2008, Wyoming has unfortunately remained in the headlines constantly for what happens in our system. Teen alleges unsafe conditions by former Natrona County juvenile detention operator. A former inmate claims that staff ordered him to clean up the blood of a child that had attempted suicide. So when we talk about putting kids in confinement, we're talking about the risks of kids being continuously re-traumatized. Abuse and neglect in Wyoming juvie jails reflects U.S. trend. The justice system has inflicted abuse and neglect upon confined youth. Former juvenile inmates settle lawsuits over Casper facilities. Former detention center worker sentenced to jail probation for sexually assaulting a juvenile inmate, sentenced to 6 months in jail for sexually assaulting a female youth. Since when is being a teenager a crime? For 20 years, Wyoming failed to collect juvenile justice data. Now again, beginning in the 1980s, there was a strong push, a call for data as a first step in identifying what was going on with our system and trying to think through how we could best help youth. And after decades, Wyoming legislature did pass a collection bill. However, there are no incentives and also no penalties for states to initiate data collection. So whether counties do or counties don't, there's no incentive and there's no enforcement. So still, we have an immense lack of data, or at least data in the hands of people that want to analyze it to find out what's going on, because it's not very good. And so you might ask yourself, based on the little data we have available, how are kids failing in our current system? So now I'm going to talk about some of this preliminary evidence of inequality in our state. Now the data we're going to be talking about today, it's from the Department of Family Services. And again, our preliminary evidence of what was made available to us shows large racial and geographic disparities across the state. So here what we see in this graph are delinquent placements by youth race. And this is between 2017 and 2020. So you see white youth, black youth, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Asian youth. You might notice that what you don't see are racial ethnicities in this chart. In this chart, white children who report being Hispanic or Latino or not are all in the white category. Now, even without having those data and being able to sufficiently analyze them, you might see some trends. So for the white youth, what you might notice is a decline in children receiving delinquent placements. But what you also might notice is that the number of black children receiving delinquent placements is very stable. So why are these kids getting a benefit and making less contact than these kids? When we're thinking about Wyoming, all of you may know that we are a predominantly white community. So despite the fact that we saw high rates of placements for white kids here, it becomes really important to control for how many kids are even in a given population, so we know better what the rate is. So here we see the proportions of delinquent placements by race for 1 year, 2019. Less than 0.5% of white youth had a delinquent placement when you control for population size. On the other hand, over 2% of Black kids in our communities were receiving delinquent placements. Put another way, Black youth were 4 times as likely to get a delinquent placement compared to their white counterparts. Now, these data don't suggest the mechanism by which this disparity is happening, but certainly given we have a lack of uniformity, a lack of standardization across the state, it's somewhat unsurprising that there might be variability in who's making decisions and how. You might wonder, are certain counties to blame for high rates of placement? So here we see delinquent placements by selected counties. Just wanted to give a few representations of what we're looking at. So we have placements in Sweetwater, Laramie, Campbell, and Natrona. And you see that some counties have very few placements. But again, it's really important to consider how many kids even live in a county and to think about the proportion of those placements. But even accounting for the amount of youth that live in a county, we still see certain counties are overrepresented in their amount of delinquent placements. So Sweetwater, in raw numbers and proportions, is leading the amount of delinquent placements across the state. And again, these data don't suggest why, but with all of the discretion, it's really unsurprising that you'd see huge variability across the state. So here's the thing, confinement is incredibly detrimental to our youth, and it's also incredibly expensive. These are raw dollars for Sweetwater and Laramie. And what you might notice is that every single year, these 2 counties are spending millions of dollars in out-of-home placements, despite the fact that out-of-home placements are worse for our kids. And you might wonder, with all that money being spent, where is it being spent? I don't have the raw numbers for what the cost is for each of these, but this is the amount of placements for group home, residential treatment, detention, the boys' school, and the girls' school. That's the majority of our placements. On the other hand, here we have things like specialized or therapeutic foster care, where kids could be placed with families that are able to meet their high support needs. There's only a handful of those, because the majority of kids are being sent to out-of-home placement outside of their community without their social support. So we still have about 1 million outstanding data questions, but a big one is this idea that race was accounted for, but not ethnicity. Had ethnicity been accounted for, based on the data we do have, we would likely see racial disparities for other groups as well. We also have a lack of understanding about the socioeconomic background of those kids. And both of these are key points because data from across the country suggests that impoverished kids, minoritized kids, those are the ones making contact with the system. But we don't have the data to show that that's exactly what's happening here, though preliminary evidence suggests strongly that it is. So now we're going to talk about the risks of youth confinement and system involvement and just why it's so detrimental to our kids. So first, let's begin by talking about normative development during the adolescent period. Again, for many of us in this room even, adolescence is not a great time. Kids are struggling with their identity, they're developing self-esteem, self-worth, trying to maintain a positive self-concept. At the same time, they're experiencing a lot of growth and development of their values and morals and how they think about the world. And importantly, for any kid, whether system involved or not, during this time, I cannot stress enough the massive biological and cognitive and social transitions that these kids are going through. And today I'll argue that confinement or system involvement more broadly, that's going to disrupt any one of these normative developmental processes. It's going to disrupt their education. It's going to disrupt their social support during an already pretty tumultuous time during normal cognitive, human, and social development. So what are the risks of youth confinement? First, let's discuss recidivism. So all youth, but especially youth accused of low-level offenses, things like status offenses, truancy, those kids, if confined, are at a significantly increased risk of recidivism compared to kids that are allegedly committing the same crimes but remain in their communities. We also know that the earlier we confine kids, the worse their outcomes. The earlier we confine kids, the more likely they are to be at risk of recidivism. And in fact, 70 to 80% of incarcerated kids are rearrested within 2 to 3 years after release. So you might ask yourself, how could these confinements possibly be rehabilitative if 70 to 80% of these kids are experiencing rearrest? Again, children, all children, but especially kids accused of low-level offenses like status offenses, they're gonna age out of these normative behaviors. Over time, they become less risky. They get a better frontal lobe. They're better able to pump the brakes. But if we confine kids, we're taking them out of their social support. We're taking them away from pro-social peers that might aid in their development. And instead, we put them at risk of being around antisocial peers instead. They also lose their ability to practice pro-social skills and decision-making to test the waters in their community. When kids are confined, they're not practicing autonomy and much decision-making at all. And then when they do come home, they're subjected to massive amounts of stigma. And then they're isolated when they return home. So even once we think that they are reintegrated, they're still being ostracized. They're not making their way back fully to the community very often. And all of this leads to really high rates of negative self-worth, a negative self-concept that's really hard for them to get past. Confinement is also associated with a slew of negative health consequences when kids are in confinement, but also when they're adults. So kids that experience confinement versus those that perpetrate the same crimes but remain in the community, they're at increased risk of substance abuse. Kids that are confined compared to kids that remain in the community, they experience significantly earlier mortality. They also are at substantially increased risk of suicide and suicide attempts. And again, these are kids that commit similar crimes, but some suffer confinement while others remain in the community, and this is the consequence. Worse than that, although we see not only these physical health symptoms, we also see how it makes kids think about their own life expectancy. So when youth are confined during adolescence, rather than remaining in the community for the same crime, these kids are significantly less likely to think that they'll even live to the age of 35. Our legislator likes to think about money a lot, so I'm just going to talk about the financial economic disadvantage that these kids face. So kids that experience confinement versus remaining in the community, we see a ton of transgenerational economic disadvantage. Kids that are confined are significantly more likely to be under or unemployed. Confined youth are less likely to finish high school. And if they do finish high school, they're less likely to pursue higher education. These youth are also significantly more likely to prematurely cohabitate and significantly more likely to experience unplanned pregnancies, all of which put them at economic disadvantage. So when we talk about the risk of youth confinement, again, it's not just for the child that experiences that confinement. We're thinking about all of their generations of children as well. So now I want to offer a few suggestions for things we could do to try to make our system more just. For one, we could expand therapeutic foster care. If we had more families that had specialized training to support kids with high needs, those kids could remain in their communities rather than going to one of these facilities. I would argue we should be redirecting funds away from those detention centers, and we could pay therapeutic foster care families a stipend to support them in their efforts to keep kids in the community. We should also eliminate concurrent jurisdiction. Now, this is not a novel suggestion. Folks have been fighting for this for decades. But if we were to eliminate concurrent jurisdiction, youth would be treated more like kids and less like adults, because the juvenile courts would have original jurisdiction. Even the Supreme Court has argued across many rulings that juveniles are not the same as adults. They're not equally culpable. They're extremely at risk for risky decision making. It's not their fault. Their brains have not matured. They're very impulsive, and it's hard for them to engage in non-impulsive behavior, especially around their peers. And so despite several Supreme Court rulings highlighting how kids are different from adults, here in Wyoming, our kids are still mostly experiencing adult courts, those that are not developmentally equipped to help those kids. Across the board, we should establish a structured decision-making tool, particularly for out-of-home placements. Again, we have broad discretion in Wyoming for prosecutors to decide where kids are seen, and then judges too have broad discretion to decide what should happen with kids. Structured decision-making tools are evidence-based and research-based, and the use of such assessments has been shown in much data to be reliable and to produce equitable outcomes. They've reduced unnecessary out-of-home placements, and they've been shown to reduce racial disparities in the way that kids are treated. And so again, by reducing the amount of discretion folks have, we're going to have decisions that are less influenced by bias because we're using a standardized tool to make these decisions. We should also establish a minimum age for out-of-home placements. Now, this is still quite alarming. Many states have a minimum age of 12 for kids to be removed from the home and end up in an out-of-home placement. And that was based on this convention in 2007. But importantly, in 2019, the same convention recommended that no one younger than 14 should ever be subjected to an out-of-home placement. And yet we continue to have a complete lack of a minimum age here in Wyoming. But again, confinement is disrupting all of these normative developmental processes, and we know that earlier confinement leads to worse outcomes for kids. We're increasing the risk of poverty across the lifetime. We're increasing the risk of poverty for their kids. And these kids are going to have worse health outcomes from earlier system involvement. We should continue to try to change our focus from one of punishment to one of prevention. Ideally, none of these kids would be system involved. There's a huge need for mental health resources across the state. There are large unmet educational situations that kids are facing. But if we were able to divert funds for better community-based preventative services, we might reduce the amount of kids that ever see the system. But if youth do become system involved, we should focus our efforts on diversion, still connecting kids to the resources that would improve their needs. And a lot of this could be accomplished by establishing standardized policies regarding diversion even. Right now, there's no standardization in diversion. Not all diversion programs are made equal. Some are evidence-based and some aren't. And so if we're going to use diversion as a tool to keep kids out of the system, then we should make sure that we're relying on evidence-based practices. Finally, some concluding remarks. We really need to continue to push for reform. Push for prevention over punishment, so that kids get developmentally sensitive treatment in the community or once they make system contact. Low-level offenses that most of us have committed should not lead to youth confinement. It shouldn't lead to confinement at a detention center. It shouldn't lead to confinement in the boys' school or the girls' school. These sorts of confinement should only be reserved for the most serious offenses where there is a real need. Importantly, other nearby states, they've started to implement a lot of these policies we've discussed today. And the ones that have implemented these policies, they're seeing a lot fewer kids go through the system. They're seeing a lot of kids not go through the system at all. They're also seeing reduced confinement rates. And they're saving a boatload of money by redirecting resources into the community to prevent kids from ever becoming system involved. We need to continue to focus on positive youth development and positive youth justice. We should be diverting all of those costly placement monies to community-based prevention services. When we confine youth with mental health needs and educational needs, they're not going to be met in confinement. We've heard from several individuals at the boys' school that they have a therapist available to come once a week when there's roughly 80 boys at the school at one time. So when they are confined, they're not going to get the mental or physical health services that they require. They're highly at risk for experiencing additional trauma. And then we're going to see reduced health and economic outcomes, again, not just for these kids, but for their children as well. We really need to continue gathering and analyzing all youth data, so data from municipal courts, circuit courts, juvenile courts. Continue gathering the data from the Department of Family Services. But most importantly, we need a way to enforce data collection. Without comprehensive data collection, we can't analyze the data. We have no idea whether our system is equitable. We have no means of tracking children across the lifespan to see which of these confinements or services leads to positive versus negative outcomes for our youth. We don't know. And we can't know unless those data are collected and analyzed. So in conclusion, the Wyoming juvenile system continues to fail our youth. And again, this isn't a new development. Folks in this room have devoted countless hours towards youth advocacy, but we're not seeing the changes that we need. These failures have led and continue to lead to extremely negative consequences for our kids that experience confinement especially. And again, it influences not only those kids, but their future generations as well. And a number of evidence-based changes, any of them could better support our youth than what our kids are experiencing today. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Again, I want to thank Scott Hinkle for all of his support. I'd like to thank three of my mentors, Dr. Nuria Nunez, Donna Sheen, Dr. Adrian Frang. I'd like to thank my graduate student helping me track down some of these very ancient statutes. I'd also like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences and the Office of Research and Economic Development for their support of this work as well. And thank you all again so much for being here today. So now we can open up for questions.
Dr. Burd, thank you for a great talk.
Thank you.
What would a more robust data collection system look like? What would it track? What would we know after having it that we don't know now? And how might we be able to use it?
So folks are working very hard on making the system that would collect the data, electronically that is. And so problematically, a lot of the data are available, but folks are not willing to report it or provide the data. Another thing that we struggle with is the ability to track kids across time. So we are really trying to push for de-identified data that would still allow us to know not the youth's identity, but whether or not we see that kid come back to the system again. And that's a real struggle for us right now. And so it's really hard because we don't have the ability to analyze longitudinal data to see what works and what isn't working for kids. So it's not that the data are not technically recorded somewhere, but it's been very difficult to get folks to deliver the data or to gather it in a way that we could use to meaningfully track kids across time.
This is a question from the Wildcast from Matt Gray. He says, phenomenal talk, Kayla, thank you. Keep up the great work. Quick question, during Narenia's introduction, she mentioned that you testified to the state legislature. I was wondering if you might be willing to comment on legislature receptivity to your observations and or any glimmers of hope on the policy horizon in Wyoming.
Thank you, Matt.
So someone was receptive. Her name is Carly Provenza. She's sitting in this room. I was told by others that I shouldn't lecture at them, which I thought was weird because that's partially what I'm paid for. But they were not receptive. They like to think of it as being abstractions and like it's really hard to implement any changes, even when we try to get them to focus on small changes that we could make that would be incremental. And so not receptive at all, really, except for Carly.
And wasn't one of, Donna, you were there, one big sticking point was to change the age at which children could go to the boys' school from, what is it now, 8?
Oh, wow.
Huh?
At the boys' school, I think it's 12, and we were trying to increase it to 16.
We were trying to increase it, and there was huge opposition to that. They wouldn't even consider it.
Oh, yeah.
And you can, so 12 is the age that the boys' school will allow, but you can still put, say, an 8-year-old through the criminal justice system in the state of Wyoming, so they could end up in your county facilities.
Yep, just not the boys' school. Right.
But even changing the age at the boys' school,
Right.
they even talked about a compromise, 12 to 14, and that just was unacceptable.
They shot it down even though in the same session, we got them to admit that most of the kids are there for status offenses. We got them to admit that most of the kids are not there for serious offenses at all. And still, hard stop. Could not possibly think of increasing the minimum age for these kids.
Could you drill down a little bit on that structured decision-making tool? I'm very curious about, that's a checklist or?
That's a great question. They can look very different depending on who's using them or what they're being used for. So in general, folks, when they're working with someone to try to help create one of these tools, to eliminate the discretion, they'll try to answer some questions about the youth. A lot of them embed risk assessments that are known to be standardized and useful elsewhere. And so it can really take many different shapes. So it's kind of appealing here because it would still give Wyoming a lot of flexibility on what that tool looked like here. But in general, they can take a lot of different forms depending on the main purpose. And so we were hoping that there would be more standardization. You know, what is the level of the offense? Is this a child's first time? Things of this nature, to try to help guide them towards overusing out-of-home placements. But it's a great question, but they can look very different depending on the tool itself.
I'm wondering, you hadn't mentioned anything about school systems that I noticed, yet children with language learning impairments and literacy impairments can be at higher risk for contact with the justice system. And so I'm wondering how you see school districts, whether at the district level or county or state level, being involved in the data collection process and in advocacy and intervention in these cases.
I love that question. Ideally, we would have all of these separate decision-making bodies providing data in one pool. So we would know what kid is at risk for learning disabilities. What are this child's risks at home? As you mentioned, many youth have one, if not more, specific learning disabilities, and those needs aren't being met. Now, we have some wonderful colleagues in this room that go into schools to help try to advocate for kids. But we're really fortunate in Albany County that that's the case. And so far as my colleagues would argue, there's not enough good folks to go around to be in the schools. There's also a lot of school resource officer involvement in kids. So on the multidisciplinary team, SROs chime in constantly about what they think should happen to kids. SROs are not developmental psychologists. They're not teachers. We need to reduce the influence of their opinions in these matters, frankly, because, just as you mentioned, we talk a lot about the school to prison pipeline, but we don't have the services that kids need very often, or there's long delays. And a lot can happen in half a school year for kids. And so ideally we'd have a lot of folks in the community trying to catch kids before things happen. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case very often here now.
I can say from the school district's perspective, working here for 11 years, it's gotten worse since I've gotten here. There used to be, you talked about single point of entry, it's gone away. Like we haven't had us, like it feels like we used to really come together. I work with the school district and we would talk about kids and we would come up with plans, and those meetings have, like we constantly are asking, like, can we please talk about this? Can we? And it just seems like services are constantly being pulled away. And so it's really, really frustrating. I know from the school, I know there are people in the school district that want these things to come back. I'm not exactly sure why they went away.
Well, I think the one thing you have to realize that because of single point of entry, the district attorney in the county is that single point of entry, and the district attorney is an elected position. And so you might have somebody who's very interested in children and they go away and the next person coming in is not interested in children. Or you may have some counties, and there are many in the state, where the prosecutor thinks the best way to take care of children is to teach them a lesson. And so in those counties, they won't even ask the school district for their opinion.
Yeah, the school district used to be really involved in single point of entry. And now, again, I know that there are a lot of people still asking to be a part of having these conversations, and the meetings just are not happening. So I can just speak for Albany. Yeah.
Kayla, thank you for this wonderful talk on this really important topic. I have two questions. One is that I think the idea of using more therapeutic foster homes is a great one, but I also have concerns about what that service looks like in those therapeutic foster homes. And some of us have been involved in trying to make sure that people who are advocating for attachment-based approaches don't come into our state. And so I guess my thought is, how can we make sure that if we're going to divert money towards therapeutic foster care, that we also have evidence-based treatment in those therapeutic foster care homes, and that people are getting good training? And then the second question is, could we also consider parent training with the parents? So for some of these like lower level behaviors, if we're going to continue to identify kids who are on that basis, could we also do the parent training with their biological parents, rather than using a therapeutic foster home?
Absolutely. I mean, I think ideally those kids would remain in their home unless really necessary for them to go elsewhere. Part of the difficulty, especially for our most rural residents, is that they don't even have folks they can lean on very easily for parent training. And so, some of our colleagues have been doing great work looking at telehealth for trauma-based services. And so I think that might be one thing that we have to lean on in Wyoming, because when these kids come from families that are impoverished, they might not have time off work. They might not have a car even to get to services. And so I'm really eager. One of the only exciting things about the pandemic, this increased use of remote care, I think that could be really helpful in the state given our rurality. And to your first point, I totally agree. We would need folks that are experts in this to develop evidence-based practices and training. Well, right now we don't even have any resources to fund the placements themselves. And so we would really need to divert that money for parent training or training to help build those therapeutic foster cares. Absolutely.
One question I have is sort of like any idea, basically I'm curious what your opinion would be on kind of, and the realisticness also of like being able to basically, instead of just trying to have like the criminal justice system try to solve the problem on its own, trying to basically the realisticness of all these different areas like the education system, if they all came together And if they all basically had little nudges, here and there that could basically help prevent it, more of like a community versus, just paying a really big punishment and then trying to contain that. I'm curious what your opinion is on just, getting a big coalition of different groups of people in different areas as opposed to just the criminal justice system to try to solve the problem. How realistic do you think that would actually be?
I mean, a lot of folks are pushing so hard to make that a reality, but a big sticking point is that all of the money keeps going to these facilities. And so we need to convince folks to reallocate that money so we can even pilot these things, right? But right now, all of the money is going to these confinement-based situations. And so we haven't even been able to try to redirect that money into the community. But certainly there are a lot of folks across the state trying to make that a reality, trying to have funds allocated to those places. And that's one of the ideas behind the juvenile service boards. And so, hopefully we can convince folks to give them more money that they can use to spread out to prevention services in their communities. So we're hopeful, but there's just so many people that still think that confinement is going to fix kids or train kids. And so that's been a major sticking point, unfortunately.
And one of the first things that they did when they did the big budget cuts was they cut the money for the community service boards. So that was the first thing that happened, and they were without funding for almost a year, right, before we managed to convince them to put the money back in. So the one thing that is exactly what you're suggesting that was working was the first thing that got cut during a budget cut.
But not funding to the confinement. No. Donna?
I just wanted to follow up on what you talked about with and the question about being able to build systems. I think the other piece of that we've always struggled with is we have to change the general public's perception and beliefs, because it may be a parent who's frustrated with the child and they think the best thing to do would be to send them somewhere. And that's where maybe a therapeutic option in the community that works with the family in crisis so that the system doesn't have a knee-jerk reaction to put them in the highest level. And I think that's part of the dynamic that's really been difficult in Wyoming to change. That has to be part of what will fix the systems.
And one of the things just to jump on that, is it really frustrated me at the Joint Judiciary to learn the large percentage of kids that are in the Boys and Girls School are there for technical issues, which means they were given, let's say, probation, and they were told that part of their probation is they had to go to school, no more smoking at school, and no drinking, and they're caught smoking, and they get sent to the boys' school for a status offense. So they were smoking at school, they got a status offense, given an edict that they weren't supposed to smoke at school anymore, smoke at school another time, and now they're in the Boys or Girls School.
I'm wondering if you have information, so we have single point of entry, prosecutor, the level of training they receive to be able to make educated decisions about what is best for the community. And then in addition to that, on the other end, with the technical issues, do we have training for our probation officers, for the people, because there's no fact finding. So there's no question of did you actually smoke or not, or is it because your homework isn't they could send them in for a variety of reasons. So I'm just curious, is there training, and maybe someone from the Bar Association is here, would love to answer that question for me. And is there evidence to suggest that would matter? Because I think that's a Band-Aid until we have a systemic change. But I would be curious if it's something we could mandate at the legislative level that might make a difference.
I think it would be incredible. Unfortunately, like with everything else we've been discussing, there's a huge lack of standardization in training. Attorneys are not receiving necessarily a lot of training in youth development. And it's certainly something that we could do. Many empirically based law schools around the country offer courses on social sciences and the law. So it's totally something we could do. And you might want to require that if someone's going to walk away with a specialization in family law, for instance. And so I think that definitely, to your point, it could be a Band-Aid, start the training there. But it's certainly not something that we have that's mandatory right now. And so we're going to continue to see just wide-reaching discretion-based decisions instead, because they're not receiving much training at all in these developmentally appropriate practices.
Related to that, what do you know about legal representation that juveniles have, and how often are they told to plead guilty when they actually could fight these accusations that they haven't done their homework or they violated their curfew? Like, why don't we see more resistance?
I love that question. We don't have the data to fully show that, but what we do know is that most children who make contact with the system would not be deemed competent to stand trial. So if I can turn this back on, I want to show you some hidden slides.
Yeah. CD.
So here we see this work is a bit outdated now. We have no reason to suspect that things are getting better. Here we see comparison between detained children and community individuals. And basically, they took a wide community sample and they gave children standardized questions on their competence to stand trial. So what we see in the white is significant impairment on these measures, mild impairment, or not impaired. What you might see right away is that the community individuals, they have much higher rates of being not impaired. But these kids that are detained have very high levels, either significant or mild impairment. And in Wyoming, we can question kids without a parent present. And a ton of psychological research shows that kids don't understand Miranda, they don't understand their rights, they're very bad with delayed discounting because of their impulsivity and the lack of brain maturation, which is totally not their fault. And so we're going to continue to see these issues, because here at least, it's not even the standard to have representation right away, let alone a parent in the room. And so there's a huge lack in those resources as well. And kids aren't equipped to be making these decisions. It's not developmentally appropriate. And yet we continue to question kids in Wyoming without even a parent present, let alone legal representation. So that's a great question. And yeah, these kids are not equipped to be making these decisions, but they're questioned alone quite regularly.
So Donna mentioned like the general public's perception. And so besides for maybe voting for people like Carly, what can we be doing to kind of help improve this problem?
You're going to continue voting for Carly.
Thank you.
You're also going to continue writing letters. I have to say it was quite easy to just show up and speak at these legislative sessions. And you can do that. You can show up and make your voice heard, send them a letter. You can continue offering your donations to places like the Wyoming Children's Law Center and other folks on campus that help with representation of impoverished individuals. And so I think there is a lot we can do, but voting I think is very key. That would help us a lot, a lot.
I have another question from the Wildcast from Siobhan Kelly. The question is, who runs the confinement facilities? Are they run by the state? Are they run by for-profit corporations? And I think the implication there is, what sort of vested interest do they have in maybe preventing some of these changes, if any?
Yeah, so it can be a mix. A lot of the state-run facilities are run with tax dollars. And so we should be eager to find out what's going on there and figuring out how our tax dollars are being spent. But we've seen a lot of conflict of interest pop up in hearings where Department of Family Service run facilities have been accused of things, and it's been quite contentious, really.
I just wanted to share that if people are interested, you might want to take a look at what the state of Oregon is doing. The University of Oregon is starting a new major for undergrads called Child Behavioral Health. And they're basically going to be training these undergrads to have therapeutic skills and to work with kids. And so not only would they be qualified to work in residential treatment, but also they would be getting parent training before their parents. and they would be, you know, people who could start therapeutic foster homes and that kind of thing. And I think that kind of a model would be incredible for Wyoming.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Absolutely.
Another question from the Wildcast from Pat Gabriel. I just heard someone mention DAs at times are in the camp of teaching juveniles a lesson. Would you comment on that approach?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's hugely variable. I mean, certainly in the history of Albany County, we've seen people more or less invested in youth. And so again, it really depends on what folks are in that position and their stance on juvenile development and juvenile confinement. And so again, that's one of the key reasons that there is so much variability. The approach that they take isn't standardized, and so it's really dependent upon who your DA is at the time.
If I don't see any more questions, I'll just say public opinion does matter, and I hope we worked on it tonight. Please and thank you. There's going to be a reception in the Cooper House. Right now, the Cooper House is the beautiful building on the corner of Grand and 15th. Please join us for food and wine, and also please and thank you. Another round of applause for Dr. Burd.